Mary Leslie, President of the LABC.
Thank you, and good afternoon as we slowly but surely make our way back down into the auditorium. And I know it's hard to leave that beautiful view out there. I hope you all enjoyed lunch and that you enjoyed this morning's session. I think it could not have been more interesting, starting with Carolyn Choi from Edison and her keynote, and followed by a panel of experts on how we're going to reach our climate goals. The Mayor Garcetti, as he said, we're leading the nation in how we get to this 100% renewable by 2045, and he's certainly leading the charge with the decisions he's been making. We really hope our mayor will agree to make permanent, as David Wright said, the solar feed-in tariff, and also go for the maximum amount of local megawatts. We would really like to see at least 300 megawatts, and the reason is because it makes good economic and environmental sense, and it really benefits not only the utility, reducing the CO2 and the GHG emissions, but it creates local jobs, and it penetrates our solar equity spots here in Los Angeles that are so important to us. The program thus far has had projects in over 40% of all the projects, in addition to bringing millions of dollars in new investment and creating thousands of new jobs and leveraging the ITC tax credit federally. We think this program is really a home run. So now, this afternoon, the good news is we will be hearing from Wade Croffoot. For many of you, he is a household name. You knew him before in the Brown administration, but not in his current capacity as Secretary of California Natural Resources Agency. This is a big job he's got. It oversees water as we know it in the state of California. And we are thrilled to have him here today to talk a little bit about what the Newsom administration is thinking in terms of water policy. We know that there is going to be emphasis on clean water. We have over 1 million people who have unsafe drinking water in California, and that has to change. We also know the federal government would like to undo many of the high standards we have for our water quality, which we do not want to have happen. So this is going to be a really important time at the Resources Department. I want to thank the LABC staff who made today possible. If you're happy, let's give them a round of applause. And I'm going to be slightly shameless and plug the LABC website, which, as you heard from Brad this morning, is a new magazine style. And I have to say, as someone who didn't visit my website very often, that it's so much more interesting now. You probably see yourself on it. Certainly this summit will be on it. You can see a portion or all of it, gavel to gavel, on the site. And we want to thank the Sugarman Communications team for having created that for us. Now it is my honor to introduce Michael Saubet, who is Vice President and co-founder of the Strategic Legacy Investment Group, who will be introducing our keynote speaker. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Saubet, Vice President of Strategic Legacy Investment Group and We Strategic Development Corp., and it is truly an honor and a pleasure to be here. As a developer of multifamily and seniors housing in Los Angeles and all over California, we are committed to contributing much-needed market rate and affordable housing to help combat our housing crisis and provide the highest levels of care for our precious seniors. We are proud to be based in Los Angeles, the nation's leader in sustainability. We see economic development and sustainability as one and the same. We cannot have one without the other. We are committed to continuing to build socially responsible developments and are proud to work with our friends in both the public and private sectors to make sure we are on the forefront of both water and energy conservation. I would like to applaud the Los Angeles Business Council for bringing awareness to this important issue of combating climate change and all that they do to help make Los Angeles a better place to live and work. Given the value we place on sustainability as a basic tenet of our business model, and our recognition that many economic benefits flow through that model, I am truly honored to introduce someone who has long expounded the truth that environmental responsibility is not only good for the planet, but also good for the bottom line. Over 20 years ago, Wade Crowfoot embarked on a mission to improve California's environmental future. From being a senior environmental advisor with Governor Newsom to becoming a regional director of the Environmental Defense Fund, Deputy Cabinet Secretary to Governor Brown, and CEO of the Water Foundation, Wade has most recently been appointed as the Secretary of California National Resources Agency. Throughout his career, Wade has led on sustainability, transportation, water, and climate change policy in California. He helped to expand California's international climate partnership, the Western Climate Initiative. During his time in the Brown administration, helped lead an effort to expand zero-emissions vehicle in the state, and has pushed for long-term availability of water resources from both public and governmental sectors. Wade brings his bevy of experience to the National Resources Agency at a critical time in our history, as climate change is driving more intense wildfires, exacerbating drought, and threatening our state's resource supply. Without further ado, please join me in a very warm welcome for our new National Resources Agency Secretary, Wade Crowfoot.
We took the photo correctly. My job here is done. Thanks so much for the opportunity to be here with you. And I've actually wanted to come to this summit several times over the last several years. So I'm excited to be here in this new capacity. And for those of you who participate in the Los Angeles Business Council, thank you. I've known of LABC and worked with Mary Leslie for about a decade. And LABC is known throughout the state, certainly in Sacramento, as a go-to business leader. When you're working to explore how to expand economic prosperity and achieve environmental sustainability, there's no one better than LABC to really bring the creativity, the credibility of business leaders, but also the open-mindedness to achieving our environmental goals. So thank you very much. What I'm hoping to do in the next 10, 15 minutes is to share with you or to frame the issues as I see it from Sacramento and from the Newsom administration, talk about both the challenges we think we face as a state and you as a region, talk about some of the opportunities, and then really dig in on two topics that are taking up a lot of my time and energy right now, which is wildfire and water. So first, I think you've heard this morning, and you already know that California is leading the world when it comes to climate action and environmental sustainability. Consider this. We're the fifth largest economy in the world, as you know. We generate over 50% of our electricity to power our lights, our electronic lives, from carbon-free energy, and throughout the state of California. And that obviously includes renewables like solar and wind. That 50% plus number also includes large hydro that doesn't have carbon emissions. So already California, the fifth largest economy in the world, is deriving over half of its energy on a daily basis from renewable energy. About half of the electric vehicle sales in our country are generated in California. So we've talked some about electrification and electrifying transportation. That movement is happening in California, or being led in California. And then lastly, as we can demonstrate sort of the progress and where we're at, the state of California, its residents are continuing to lead. Last week in Sacramento, one of our agencies, the State Water Board, adopted a new wetlands policy that is actually meant to protect wetlands in an appropriate way without unnecessarily inhibiting development. And so at a time when you see the Trump administration actually moving away from environmental protection, or in some cases attacking environmental protection, you have the state of California doubling down on environmental protection in a way that still grows our economy. So if California is leading the world, Los Angeles, I would say, in greater Los Angeles, is leading California. The investment that your county and your city has made in transportation, parks, water, is the envy of the state. Measure M, measured AA, recently measured W in the fall. Angelinos get it, which is we need to invest in improving our transportation, expanding open space access to all communities, becoming far more sustainable and self-sufficient on water. And your folks, your voters, have actually put their money where their mouth is. The vision that the mayor and the county board are articulating is impressive. And it would be one thing if it was a small city. I did a lot of work in San Francisco, and so sometimes our friends in Los Angeles like to call San Francisco a boutique city. And while I deeply resented that while working for Mayor Newsom in San Francisco, I think that there's a point, which is the goals that Mayor Garcetti and the county board are putting out are really ambitious in one of the largest metropolitan areas of the world, and one of the most highly visible and well-recognized and kind of respected areas of the world. So the fact is, you have leadership that's swinging for the fences down here, that's actually making progress at huge scale. And if you can pull it off down here, that will make a difference, not only in California, but the entire world. And then you've got some real creativity and imagination. Right after this, I'm going to be down at the lower LA River to really understand how the state can support the big vision to really transform the LA River and the entire upper lower river. And that's the kind of creativity that in Sacramento and state policy circles we're seeing from LA. So I just want to acknowledge that. So while California and Los Angeles are leading on climate action and environmental sustainability, we have huge challenges to confront. And I won't share anything new, but I'll just reinforce what you're probably already recognizing. One is we have major economic and social challenges. Our economy is growing at impressive rates, but more and more Californians are being left behind. Income inequality is expanding. Poverty is growing. Homelessness is more visible than it's ever been. I have a 4-year-old daughter, and I live in Oakland, and it breaks my heart that now she's conditioned to seeing folks on the street asking for money, and seeing people that she thought were camping, like our family camps, in tents in the park, and I had to explain that those people don't have homes. If you have kids, I'm sure they're being socialized in the same way, and it scares me that that's going to be the experience and the norm growing up. And so I appreciate the work of LABC and other economic leaders in Los Angeles, understanding that income inequality and inequity is not only morally problematic, it's horrible for our economy. And if you compare our economy to places with bifurcated, very wealthy and desperately poor, those are not economies that function well. So that's obviously a primary challenge. My agency is a natural resources agency. So think water, land, parks, fish and wildlife, forests, fire, oil and gas. Don't really touch on the economic issues, but you're here today talking about environmental sustainability, and environmental sustainability has to be interwoven with economic and social equity. And I am proud to work for a governor who in his first 90 days has put these issues, elevated these issues on the statewide policy agenda. And of course, strong leadership from the legislature and Governor Brown as well. Those are economic, social challenges. Let me talk about the environmental challenges we face. Climate change. We used to talk about climate adaptation or resilience, and it was always about reducing greenhouse gas emissions and adapting or adaptation. And adaptation was always kind of the sleepy, wonky, back burner issue. Everybody was focused on reducing greenhouse gases, decarbonizing our economy, and for good reason. It's what we need to do to save our planet. But adaptation was always seen as sort of a conceptual planning exercise to address impacts decades into the future. The future is now. Climate change is taking lives in California. Most recently, almost 100 lives in the town of Paradise, less than 8 months ago, in the most destructive wildfire season in California's history. Climate change impacts are no longer about planning or doing something that is nice. It's about protecting people's lives in California and protecting the nature that actually makes our place so unique. So what do we know about climate change? We know that the drier periods will become drier. The drought that we experienced just a few years ago those kinds of shortages will become longer and more punishing. We know the wet periods will become wetter, when we'll get a higher portion of our water every winter through these intense atmospheric rivers that threaten flooding, certainly in Los Angeles. And then wildfire. Easily the two most destructive wildfire seasons in California history in the last 2 years. Again, I live in the Bay Area, and I got my 4-year-old, we had to buy my 4-year-old an N95 certified mask with teddy bears on that so she'd wear it. And she wore that for the better part of a month because of the air quality. At one time, the Bay Area this summer had the worst air quality in the world for a series of days. And I'm not telling you anything you don't know because you experienced horrific wildfires that took lives in your communities down here. But these are the pressing challenges that we face. And I would say Southern California, despite your leadership, is particularly vulnerable. You have millions of Angelenos and residents living in the wildland-urban interface. And I would venture a guess that a lot of these folks don't understand that they are at fire risk. Take the community of Santa Rosa, or even the community of Malibu, where folks that are not next to a wildland, a woodland or a forest, don't feel like they could be victims of wildfire. Well, the challenge is these wildfires are changing, and their behavior is pushing intense winds, which are pushing embers up over the fires. So in Northern California, we saw tremendous devastation in the town of Santa Rosa, in the inner urban core of Santa Rosa. Those folks, when they got evacuated, we've talked to some, they actually thought it was a precautionary measure that they were being evacuated. And they went to get dinner, and 5 hours later they came back, and their neighborhood was leveled. Well, guess what? That is a realistic threat for millions of people that live in Southern California. And we have to address wildfire risk with that level of urgency. Likewise, on the water side, the whole LA River system was built and made concrete for flood control as a result of horrific floods a century ago. And so flooding is a risk. And then, of course, drought, because a lot of the water that gets consumed in the LA basin doesn't come from here. So I don't want to be doom and gloom, but I think we need to attack our water challenges and our wildfire challenges with the urgency that the crisis demands. So where are the opportunities in this? The good news is that we have leadership that gets it. So again, first 100 days, Governor Newsom has taken a series of actions on wildfire safety that I'll talk about, as well as prioritizing a set of a portfolio of actions on water. Likewise, the legislature gets it. I'd say, if you're an observer of policy dialogue in Sacramento, you'd agree that wildfire and wildfire risk is priority 1A right now in Sacramento. And legislative leadership, Speaker Rendon, Senate Pro Tem Tony Atkins, are leading the way on really what are the policies and investments we need to make to protect California on the climate resilience side. And then, like I said, you've got really strong, proactive leadership here. We've got some recent funding. Past June, statewide voters passed Proposition 68 that was led by many groups in Los Angeles, $4 billion for water and parks, both to modernize our water system for drought and flood, but also to expand access for parks. Southern California has some of the most park-poor communities in the state. A lot of us live in communities that are blessed by a lot of open space and parks. Millions of Angelenos and Southern Californians don't. And so Prop 68 is meant to be a down payment to expand access to parks. I'm heading to the LA Historical State Park later tonight. Great example of actually bringing open space to an area of Los Angeles that didn't have enough of it. And then I would just say, in terms of opportunities, I think Californians get it. They understand that economic prosperity does not and should not be set in conflict with environmental sustainability. And you all know this because you're at an environmental sustainability summit. But I will say that it's remarkable, if you look at public opinion polling, that Californians don't want to sacrifice coastal and ocean protection, water quality, open space for economic growth. And guess what? We don't have to. Our economy, our economic growth is outpacing national economic growth while we're continuing to lead with landmark environmental leadership. So let me just talk about a couple of the actions, and I want to make sure I have time for questions or comments if attendees would like to ask them. So on wildfire, you know, Governor Newsom spent time, even before he was sworn into office, in the town of Paradise, result of the Camp Fire in Butte County, and saw the firsthand devastation. And what he realized is there are a lot of communities in the state that are equally vulnerable to wildfire, not only as a result of where they're situated with that wildfire risk, but also because of lack of transportation access in and out of the community and demographics, including age, mobility, infirmity. So asked us in his first day in office, issued an executive order to CAL FIRE, which is under our agency, to identify and prioritize or rank the most vulnerable communities in California and identify the wildfire safety projects that could be done before the next fire season, otherwise known as this summer, to protect those communities. CAL FIRE developed a list of 200 of the most vulnerable communities based on fire risk, transportation access, demographics. And the governor last week issued an emergency proclamation that allows my position to waive contracting requirements and environmental permitting requirements, so 35 projects over 90,000 acres of land can actually be implemented to create defensible space around those 200 communities. Now, it's a big deal, and we don't take lightly suspending CEQA, California Environmental Quality Act, and other environmental laws to get this done. But the governor recognizes that these communities face peril as early as this summer, again, as a result of drier forests that make fire activity, mega fire, larger and more damaging than ever. Let me mention that the wildfires of the last 2 years, in terms of the carbon that they've emitted, have wiped out the carbon emission savings that we've achieved as a result of Assembly Bill 32 or AB 32. So what we realize is if we're going to be international leaders and actually reduce our carbon footprint, we actually need to address forests and wildfires because if we don't, our carbon goals will not be reached. So there's that urgent effort to protect vulnerable communities, and then there's a broader effort to really manage our forests more proactively. One consequence of settlement over the last 100 years in California is we've suppressed fire. Fire is a natural cycle in woods and forests, and native tribes from time immemorial actually managed forests through prescribed fire. As California developed and we moved up the mountains and into the forests and into the woods, our focus has been on suppressing fire. And while we thought that was helpful to protect public safety, it's created a woods, sort of a density of forests and woods that's actually not natural and has sparked, taken what would be normal size fires based on historical averages and made those into mega fires. So we actually have to work across agencies in the state, the federal government, the Forest Service, local governments, to actually get in there and manage our forests in ways that actually emulate those natural cycles. We have to be careful not to impact the environment and habitat as we do that. But essentially doing nothing there is untenable at this point. I'll say also, it's not only about what we do in the forest, it's about protecting our communities from within our communities, home hardening. So we talked about those, I talked about those houses in the urban wildland interface, a wildland-urban interface. We need to harden those homes. So when we do have fires that bring embers in the sky, they're not instantly combusting those homes. We have some of the strongest building standards in the country right now for new homes to make them fire safe. But the problem is the vast majority of homes in these vulnerable communities are existing homes. And many of these vulnerable communities, particularly the rural ones, are fairly poor. So the question is, how do you help change out roofing materials or harden the siding of homes so that it's not so flammable when you have an old home with a resident that doesn't have a lot of money, and we're tackling that. So there's essentially sleeves rolled up, all hands on deck effort to advance all of this work on wildfires. And we have what's called the Governor's Forest Management Task Force to bring the feds and the locals and the state together. And we're really optimistic about that. Huge challenge, but one we think we can face. Let me talk about water. The governor, in his State of the State address that's given annually, his first State of the State, he was very clear, water is a priority of this administration. And there was open question about whether it would be, given all of the other challenges, affordability, housing, immigration, et cetera. But he has leaned forward, and both privately with his appointees and publicly through the State of the State said, we need to continue to position California to have a resilient water system, both for cities, towns, and also nature for the next century. And we're going to do so in a couple of important ways. One, the governor continues to believe, as do I, that we need to modernize our conveyance, which is a fancy way to say, essentially modernize the infrastructure that moves snow and water from where it falls in the mountains, primarily in Northern California, to where people live in the Bay Area and Southern California. And this discussion has been reduced to this question of tunnels, whether there should be tunnels through the Bay Delta. From our perspective, we're not shying away from this controversial question about whether we should actually build conveyance through the Bay Delta. We believe that actually a tunnel, an earthquake-safe tunnel that is resilient to sea level rise and saltwater intrusion into the Bay Delta is essential to protect the water supplies of upwards of 30 million people, including everybody in this room. It's not an easy topic, it's terribly complicated, and it's controversial in some parts of the state, but we think we need to move it forward. However, if the water policy is only reduced to a question of a tunnel or no tunnel, we've failed. There's so much more that we have to be doing on water throughout the state, and we have to be partnering with the local water agencies. Think LADWP and so many others in Southern California. 85% of the spending on water infrastructure happens at the local level. So the state can think whatever it wants, but if it's not partnering with the locals and actually aligned with the locals, we're not going to build more resilience. And so the governor has called on my agency or our agency and other agencies to come together and identify a portfolio of priorities. For example, expanding water recycling where feasible. Your mayor has been remarkable on that with an announcement he gave the last couple of weeks about reducing ocean discharges at the Hyperion waste treatment system and recycling that water. Expanding stormwater capture. It's remarkable in Los Angeles. I'm sure you look at Twitter and see how much water flows out of the LA River into the sea. That's water that should be permeating into groundwater basins for future use to build your own local reliability. Your leaders get this. Sheila Kuehl, Hilda Solis led an effort to pass this Measure W last year, generates $300 million a year to capture more stormwater, get it underground. And not only will that help with water supply, it'll help with all of the trash and contaminants that currently go out of the LA River. You know that at certain times of the winter, your beaches are actually unswimmable because of contaminant and bacteria levels. We can and we should all be doing much more about that. I'll tell you that I looked on Twitter and saw a real-time video of the Bayona wetlands, which is where a lot of the LA River drains, and it was disgusting. There was plastic. There had to be tons of plastic pushing out of there, and the same is true in the Bay Area or anywhere on the coast. So the question is, how do we actually identify these priorities, like stormwater capture, like water recycling, like expanding energy or water efficiency and conservation, so we become more sustainable? So our communities can actually weather these longer dry periods, as well as these more intense wet periods. I'm really energized about this work. I think it's a critical moment in time, not only because of the opportunities that we have, but the challenges that we face. And I think the leadership that we demonstrate in California, and I use we collectively, your leadership as business leaders or community leaders in Los Angeles, is going to be super critical for the fate of the world. We used to think about it just in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions while expanding our economy, and that's really important. But I'd like to, and I think the governor is committed to, expanding that definition of climate and environmental leadership. Not only are we leading the world reducing emissions while building our economy, we're leading the world by protecting our people and nature against the inevitable changes that are already happening as a result of global warming and climate change. So I'm excited to be here. I'm looking forward to partnering with you all Big thanks to LABC for being, in so many ways, part of the solution. And let me transition to questions or comments for anybody who has them. Oh, sorry, you don't really have the capability. So telepathically communicate your questions to me, and I'll answer. Well, listen, one thing I will say then in closing is a big principle of Gavin Newsom since he was mayor of San Francisco was being transparent and accessible. And so I'll tell you that he's got a new system for responding to constituent requests and feedback that we're really elevating. And I give you that as an example. But the point is this. We invite your ideas and we invite your engagement. Again, if you're a member of the business community, if you're a community leader, if you're from a non-governmental organization, please find me and my agency in Sacramento. The solutions aren't going to be generated in the state capitol. They're going to be generated and are being implemented right now in places like your own communities. So with that, onward, Godspeed. Thank you for having me.
Now, please welcome our Water Conservation, Resources, and Technology panelists with moderator David Nahai, partner at Lewis, Brisbois, Bisgarden Smith, LLP.
Actually, I have no idea what number.
I think I'm 3.
I don't know.
Hello, everybody. All right. Well, with Secretary Crowfoot's very comprehensive coverage of water issues throughout the state, I thought perhaps our water panel was rendered superfluous, but I'm sure we'll find many things to talk about. Let me start by just expressing appreciation for LABC and the entire LABC team. Mary Leslie, Nadine Watt, Brad Cox, and the staff, especially Adam Lane, for putting on, again, another magnificent conference today. Let's give them a round of applause.
Absolutely.
My name is David Nahai. I'm a partner at the Lewis Brisbois law firm. I'm also president of David Nahai Consulting Services. I'm the former general manager and commission president at the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. So let me introduce our truly stellar panel. You'll find their bios in your packets. I'm not going to go through their entire bios because of time issues, of course. But seated immediately to my left is Mr. John Allen, who's the director of Division 3 of the Water Replenishment District of Southern California. Next to him is Mr. Gary Giroux, who's the first Chief Sustainability Officer of Los Angeles County. Seated next to Gary is Ms. Judith Ibarra-Planqueta, who is the Vice President and Director of Client Relations at Tetra Tech. Next, Mr. Jeff Keitlinger is the General Manager and CEO of the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. And next to Jeff is Mr. Doug Walters, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer and Chief Resiliency Officer at the Sanitation Bureau of the City of Los Angeles. Please give them all a round of applause. Let me start by just saying a couple of things to lead into the conversation with the panelists. I think we can all remember, I hope we can all remember, that iconic image of Governor Brown standing on top of a bone-dry mountain that should have been covered with snow as he lamented the horrible drought that gripped California. Between 2011 and 2017, we experienced one of the worst droughts in our history. And with it came an untold amount of financial and social misery. I think we're fortunate that our leaders in California and here in Southern California have vowed that we will not be flat-footed, the next time another drought hits. Right now, we have rain and snow everywhere, but this is just a consequence of the impacts of climate change. We can expect protracted droughts followed by periods of intense precipitation, which is what perhaps we're experiencing right now. So I think our leadership is taking steps to make sure that we're indeed prepared to meet the next drought, the next water shortage that comes along. And this is why you have, at the state level, laws requiring water agencies to report and conserve. You have the new proposals that have been put forward by Governor Newsom. Here in Los Angeles, we have the Mayor Garcetti's directive that all wastewater discharges to the ocean must cease by the year 2035, that we must source 50% of our water locally by 2035, and other directives as well. But these things, these measures, as essential as they are, and I believe them to be essential, do come at a cost. They require investments to be made, and that in turn means being able to speak with the people of Los Angeles, with the voters, with the ratepayers, about the investment conversation. And I want to start there. And I'd like to start first with Jeff Keitlinger. And let's talk about that. Let's talk about how you see, Jeff, the current mindset of the people that you serve, the 19 million people who benefit from the service that you provide. Has conservation settled in? Is it part of our collective mindset now? Or do we need to ensure that conversation continues with the people so that they understand that the plenty that we're experiencing right now may not be here tomorrow? Give us your views on that.
Well, thank you very much, David, and happy to be here. One of the things you talked about was about being in a drought, and we've had a pretty significant drought here. I don't know if people remember, 10 of the last 12 years in California have been dry, have officially drought years. 5 of those years were governor-declared emergency drought years, 2 of them by Governor Schwarzenegger and 3 by Governor Brown. That 2015 picture of Governor Brown standing on a non-existent snowpack, not only was it the driest year in recorded history in California, based on tree ring evidence, we think it was the driest year in California in over 1,200 years. So, we had a record-shattering drought here in California. Interestingly enough, there are 5 true Mediterranean climates in the world. 3 have had incredible droughts this century: Australia, South Africa, and California. And California's drought was as severe as when Cape Town went to day 0, and Australia called it their millennial drought, and they did a crash program on building desal. One of the reasons we didn't have that severe dislocation is we're a little more used to these incredibly abrupt cycles here, and so we're a little more prepared. 2 of those years in the last 12 have been extremely wet, and we managed to refill our storage full in both those years, 2011 and this year. And we are moving rapidly to probably put a record amount of rain into our reservoirs in a single year. The good news is I don't really see people relaxing. Our water use remains low throughout the region, and we've done polling, and at the start of the drought, so 12 years ago, probably about 1 in every 10 to, it was about 20%, so I guess that'd be 2 out of 10 Californians said drought and water were significant. Our polling now shows that 8 to 9 out of every 10 people are saying water is a significant concern in California. So this last decade has really gotten people thinking about it. That's positive. We don't see people bouncing back to their old water habits. And that has really enabled us to actually store a record-breaking amount of water this year, because when we have a nice wet year and low demands, that all goes into storage, that excess.
Thank you. I want to come back and also talk about the recycling plant in Carson and the tunnels. But let me move next to Gary, if I may. You've been hard at work on the county sustainability plan. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that, and then in the second round of questions, I want to talk with you about Measure W.
Of course, yeah, happy to talk about that. And yes, we have been hard at work, and I'm actually really honored and proud to be able to announce today that we are releasing our sustainability plan. I think we have a slide I'd like to put up. This is really the preeminent sustainability event in Los Angeles. We wanted to use this opportunity to announce the availability of our plan. It's available on our website. And this is a regional, a comprehensive, and an ambitious approach to sustainability for all of Los Angeles County. This is not just unincorporated areas, but it's for all of the 88 cities. And the idea of that is that we really wanted our plan to serve as a template for cities. And I talk about the Paris Agreement a lot as a model for how we're structuring our own plan. We're setting regional targets, and I'll talk about some of those in a moment. And we're going to make our contributions to the extent that we can with the 1.1 million in the unincorporated areas. But then we also are hoping and anticipating that cities will pick up our plan and use it as a template. I am proud that we've worked very hard to create collaboration with the City of Los Angeles, and a lot of our plan aligns with and overlaps with the city's own sustainability plan that'll be coming out in a couple of weeks. But the reason why we really took this regional approach, I want to actually ask a question to the audience here, which is, how many of you live in Los Angeles County? Raise your hands. Great. And keep your hands up or raise your hands if you don't live in the city of Los Angeles. So that's exactly what we're talking about. Most people don't actually live in the city of Los Angeles. Most people live in one of the 87 other cities. And the average size of a city in Los Angeles County is about 60,000 people. It's an Artesia or a Hawthorne or a Southgate. And so that's really where sustainability needs to go. These are not city-specific issues. These are regional issues, whether it's urban heat or stormwater, which we'll talk about, or complete streets. And so we really wanted to bring that regional approach to it. The other thing we wanted to do, and if we could change the slide so you can actually see the website, is bring the 3 E's strongly in. So, of course, the plan is comprehensive, that it contains or addresses traditional environmental media, but also economy and workforce development, land use, transportation, housing. But we strove to weave equity as a core value in this plan, and we worked very hard with some 11 public workshops, talking with the community to really get ideas from the community. And equity is absolutely a singular focus for us in the plan. And so you will see that when you go to the county's website. It's at ourcountyla.org. You can see it there on the bottom of the slide. If you go there now, you can actually start looking at the plan, but I'd tell you not to do that because this is going to be a really good panel. But
don't go there now.
But it is available now. And maybe I'll just talk quickly about the water elements of it, since this is the water panel. We take the view that we're looking at healthy watersheds, water bodies, and waterways. We're looking at water quality and supply, including water quality as it pertains to drinking water quality. And then we're also concerned about flooding due to climate change. And so that could be both from severe precipitation events that may punctuate some droughts. It may also be from sea level rise. And we set some very ambitious targets and goals, including ultimately sourcing 80% of our water locally. So I'm going to leave it there, but happy to talk more about that today and with anybody after the event.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you. Doug, let's go to you next. And the mayor's announcement that we're going to cease discharging wastewater to the ocean by the year 2035 is as essential a step as it is bold and ambitious. They say, it's not waste unless it's wasted, and we don't need to discharge our wastewater to the ocean any longer. We have the technology to treat it. So I'd like to ask you, how is it that we're going to actually realize that goal, especially at Hyperion, where something like, I think we process 560,000 acre-feet a year at Hyperion, and the idea would be to take Hyperion to full advanced treatment and then transport the water, and we'll be asking John Allen about this in a minute, transport the water perhaps to the central basin for injection into the aquifer. Can you tell us what the steps are going to be to realize that, and also cover how we're going to talk to the ratepayers about the cost of doing that, or where is it that we expect to find the money to do all of that?
Thank you, David. It's good to be here as well with this esteemed panel and with everybody in this room. It's incumbent that we stay aggressive to meet those goals. And really, it's the goals of all of us in all the cities that we live in, Los Angeles and the county, because we continue to say how precious water is, right? The technology is there to treat it, to purify it to a greater standard than we have been historically, because we don't know when the next catastrophe is going to take out the state water canal, right? So the combination of the advanced treatment that we are working on, we've got some membrane bioreactor pilots that are scheduled to be taking place over the next 2 years to look at some different vendors and their technologies to see how efficiently, so that we don't use a single additional ratepayer dollar if we don't have to. The volume is there, right? We're sort of geographically at the end of the line. All the water that is wasted, flushed down the sinks and the toilets from all the 4 million people in the city of Los Angeles and all the businesses comes down through our upstream plants, virtually almost all of it to Hyperion, except for the amount that goes to our Terminal Island water reclamation plant, where we do have advanced treatment there as well. So it's a combination of the technology to meet that goal by 2035 per the mayor, but it's also an understanding in working with all the stakeholders, all the ratepayers, all the non-government agencies, organizations, both inland and at the water, to understand the importance of that there really isn't any other option, because when those catastrophes do occur, we've got very few alternatives but to source our water locally. So all of those are signs that we need to continue to do the right thing, to rely on the technology, but also to rely on one another to ask questions where there may not be a comfort level in understanding how safe the water is. Just having your government say it isn't enough. We learned that 20 years ago when we went through the toilet to tap sort of debacle, if you will. But that gave people some pause, but it also allowed us more opportunity to work with school children. So those children that learn that water can be treated safely are now voting age adults. And so you see the progress on measures like Measure W, with 70% of our LA County population passing those things, because they're starting to understand the need and the impacts of climate change that the previous speaker addressed. So there's a lot more acceptance as to that it's safe to use in industries for cooling water. It's safe to use for in-plant purposes. Already about a third of Hyperion's water is used through the West Basin Municipal Utility District, where they polish it further for irrigation purposes and things of that nature. But we want to use 100% of it, and we've got some more years to do that. So I have no doubt that we'll be able to reach that target.
Okay, great, thank you. So let me turn to you, John. So assuming that Hyperion goes to full advanced treatment, and the idea would be necessarily to store the water locally for use locally, one of the ideas is that it would be transported to the Central Basin, which is under the jurisdiction of the Water Replenishment District, to be stored in the aquifer in the Central Basin. Now, you had judgments approved recently at the Water Replenishment District, which I think changed the administration structure a little bit. I think there are like 3 bodies that now administer the groundwater basins that are under the jurisdiction of the Water Replenishment District. How do you see that this would work? Are there any legal impediments, physical impediments to receiving the water from LA, storing it in the basin, and then from our point of view, just as importantly, LA being able to extract that water to use it without having to go through some lengthy, adjudication process?
Well, there's about 150 million gallons a day that is sent from Hyperion out into the ocean, which works out to about 168,000 acre-feet of water, which would sustain about 1,700,000 people if you use 10, and I think we're in a conservation area, so we can say an acre-foot will sustain 10 people for a year. So we're talking about some sizable water and some sizable population. Now, about 20 years ago, it became apparent that we needed to have some storage capacity in the Central Basin and in the West Basin. They're two different basins, and they're in the southern part of Los Angeles County, entirely within Los Angeles County. It's about 43 cities and about 4 million people. After years of stop-and-go negotiations and wrangling and wondering whether people could own water and pump water and sell water, it was decided that this water, whatever water we had, was a public good, and it could be stored and should be stored. And we set up a mechanism to store water. Both these basins, the West Coast Basin and the Central Basin, are adjudicated basins, which means that the stakeholders, which are primarily the pumpers, went to court and settled it, but they had to have a court order before they could change anything. And after this long negotiation, years and years and years, Central Basin did create storage for about 330,000 acre-feet in December of 2014. And the West Coast Basin created 120,000 acre-feet of storage in December of 2015. That is, the judge signed the order. Everybody agreed, they got an order to the judge, and the judge signed an order. So we have the capacity. That's the legal part. Now what we need to do is work with our partners in the Los Angeles City Sanitation District, in the Los Angeles Department of Public Water and Power, to bring that water over to us. That would take some infrastructure, that would take pipes and pipelines, and then putting it in the ground by using injection wells, where you pump it into the deeper aquifers. There's several different aquifers that underlie us in the Water Replenishment District. We could be taken to the spreading grounds and put in there. Now, that's another partnership, because the water that would be pumped into our area, but we would have to work with the Los Angeles County Department of Public Works. And they would be very happy to work with us to fill up the aquifers. Then, to put it in, there is a storage panel made up of people from the West Coast Basin and the Central Basin, and the entire board of directors of the Water Replenishment District, that has to decide that this is beneficial, and it would be beneficial to store it because we are in a continuing drought cycle. I personally think we've been in a drought cycle since early 2007. That would make 12 years. So we need this water, and it would be a good place to put it, and then it could be pulled out by the city of Los Angeles or whoever, depending on what was decided when it was put in, pulled out and used when we have these drought situations.
Okay, great. So in order to pull the water out, the city of Los Angeles wouldn't need a new court order. There would not be needed a new adjudication process.
No,
okay, I just want to establish that.
They would be credited with that water.
Great. Thank you very much, John. I have the next question for you, Judith, but I'd like to set it up by asking Gary the question first, okay? Which is about Measure W.
Sure.
And talking about, the mindset of the people of LA County. The people really showed what that mindset is by a super majority deciding, in effect, to tax themselves by approving Measure W. I mean, it restores one's faith in humanity. It really does. But now they've made that statement,
Sure.
and it is up to our water leadership in order to fulfill the promise of Measure W. Can you take a couple of minutes? Tell us how Measure W works, because there's a fairly complicated process that's been put in place to ensure accountability and to ensure that people are answerable and that the process is monitored, and how we're going to make sure that we fulfill the promise of Measure W. And then I have a question for you.
Absolutely, and yes, we're tremendously grateful to the people of Los Angeles County for giving us that opportunity. If only we'd been so successful 5 or 10 years ago, this recent rains that we had this year, we would have been able to capture a lot of that water and put it into storage and beneficially reused it. The process from here is really a bit of a bureaucratic one. So in November, of course, the voters approved the measure. The first thing that will happen, and it will actually happen this month, will be the formation of the committees that actually oversee the implementation of the program. So there's a regional oversight committee, there's a scoring committee, as it's called, a technical committee that actually reviews proposals and evaluates them, and then 9 specific watershed-based committees. And the process to put those committees together is now ongoing. This is, in some ways, a political process, as you can imagine, ongoing within the Board of Supervisors. We do expect that the Board of Supervisors will actually make those appointments by the end of April. So you can see that by the end of this month. Of course, there's a lot of just simple paperwork that needs to be developed. The Flood Control District and Public Works staff are developing all those forms and applications and model agreements. Perhaps the critical piece, although the actual flow of money is more critical, but the next critical piece in terms of implementation is what's called the implementation ordinance. And that ordinance will codify the program elements that were presented and developed in a stakeholder process and presented to the Board of Supervisors when the Board of Supervisors voted to put the measure onto the ballot. The implementation ordinance will take the program elements language, put it into legal language for an ordinance. That ordinance will be out publicly for review in late summer, probably the August timeframe, and then ultimately go to the Board of Supervisors for adoption. That's a critical path element because we need that ordinance in place in order to actually put the taxes on the bill starting when the assessor sends out the bills at the end of the year, which is, probably quite well, when the bills go out, the collections start. The first payment is in December. The second one, probably people are painfully aware of this, is in April, so coming up soon. So starting in December of this year, and then again in April, we'll start actually collecting the money. And I would anticipate that by early next year, January, February, we'll be able to actually start allocating the money out to studies and to project activities. The last thing I'll say on this is that the funds are allocated according to formula. Half the funds go back to cities to use for their own stormwater programs. 40% of the funds the county will have for regional projects, and then 10% of the funds will be used for the administration of the program. So all of that money will start flowing early next year.
All right, but what I understood. But what I wanted to get to was that there is built into the entire Measure W structure and process a set of checks and balances, because there's a lot of money that is going, but a lot of it is going to the cities to use. And so there will be a system of monitoring how that money is used and the kinds of results that are going to be achieved as a result of the expenditure of that money. Is that correct?
That's absolutely right. And that's, at the end of the day, the Board of Supervisors is the ultimate responsible party, right? So they're going to be getting reports through that committee structure. Those committees not only are going to be deciding on what projects are, but will also be evaluating projects.
Okay.
And so the Regional Oversight Committee, once it's established, actually doesn't report to LA County Flood Control District or Public Works, but reports directly to the board.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Gary. And so as the voice of the private sector on the panel today, so let's start with Measure W and how the private sector views this opportunity, how you view the entire structure. Do you think there's room for improvement? How do you see Measure W actually affecting the private sector players?
Well, thank you, David, and good afternoon, everyone. I want to first thank the Los Angeles Business Council for the opportunity to be on this esteemed panel with all my colleagues here. And what a great way to start out Earth Month than by talking about water. So when we talk about stormwater, we talk about funding of stormwater projects. It's a continual challenge across the United States. You know, it's hard to quantify it. It's hard to think about it as a reliable source for drinking water, and on and on. There's a lot of challenges around it. And so when the citizens of Los Angeles County, voted with a resounding passage of Measure W late last year, that was huge. That was a huge moment for us. And for the folks that have been working in this industry for a while, who've been advocating for infrastructure improvements, there's obviously a great sense of excitement around it, and wanting to get moving as quick as possible. So there's the expectation right now out there that we move from passage to implementation kind of at the snap of our fingers. Everyone's like, let's get going. Where are the projects? Let's get moving on this. And as Gary mentioned, it's not that easy. There's a lot of things that need to get set up for the program before we get to the implementation, and he touched on a lot of them: governance, policies, procedures. How are we going to audit? How are we going to account for the funding? How are we going to be equitable in our spending in the projects? And so there's a lot of things that go into that. And so it's not going to happen at the snap of our fingers, but I would say anything to accelerate it would be fantastic. And I know the county's working on it. I know all the cities are ramping up on their own programs and how they're going to be managing their funding. So I think that's definitely an area that we can improve on. And of course, with any project, any program, communication, right? So communicating to the people that voted, especially on this measure, the people that are spending their hard-earned money, on infrastructure improvements. I think communicating to them is key, and communicating to all the stakeholders, not just private industry, all the stakeholders that are involved in our water portfolio, and communicating to them along the way how the process is working, how the governance structure is being set up. There's always room for improvement on that. And then, of course, transparency. So, how can we make all these policies and procedures and everything that's going on more transparent to the public? So again, bringing back that accountability to all the people that have taken, have made that their voice loud and clear that they want to invest in water infrastructure. So I think, acceleration, communication, transparency are all great ways of improving the program. But again, not to take away from the fact that this is really an exciting time in water, and all the projects that we're talking up on the stage. And you hear a lot about investing in infrastructure. You hear a lot of electeds talk about it, but it's quite different that in Los Angeles, we're actually doing something about it and investing in it. So that's really exciting. So that's my perspective on it.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that. Jeff, if I may return to you. So I know that MWD, put its support behind the concept of 2 tunnels. That has since changed to we're going to have 1 tunnel. But I wanted to ask you what this means in practicality, because it isn't as if there were 2 tunnels and now one of them's gone and we're left with the one that remained. This requires a new set of of plans as to where that one tunnel is going to be. It also means perhaps a revisiting, even more importantly, of where the intakes are going to be and how they're going to function. Can you give us a quick rundown of where we stand, what this means to Southern California?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely, David. So California, Southern California gets a little more than 55% of its water from two places, and they're far away, the Colorado River and Northern California. And both of those supplies of water have been impacted by climate change as we lose snowpack in the Rocky Mountains and the Sierra Mountains. Pretty critical that we continue to hang on to those as a baseline, because when we talk about recycled water, most of the water that we see in the Whittier-Carson plant and the Hyperion plant is this imported water that we then want to recycle. So until you have to start with something to then reuse it. So pretty critical we maintain these and stabilize them as best we can. Well, the plan in Northern California to stabilize that supply was to build a tunnel bypass system that goes under the delta. And this started in the Schwarzenegger administration, and we completed the planning process in the Brown administration. And the idea is that with climate change, as we go from less snow to more rain, that water is going to be only available for very brief periods of time. Basically, California gets 2/3 of its precipitation in 14 days. And it comes in the form of these major atmospheric rivers. And when it's snow, terrific. We've got months to let it melt and collect it. When those major storms become rain, we've got days. And so the idea was we're going to build some large tunnels, 40-foot barrel tunnels, 35 miles long, and pick the water up on the Sacramento River then instead of the south of the delta as the Sacramento River goes roaring out to the Golden Gate in those big, huge storm events. And then the rest of the time, they'd probably sit there fairly idle, and it was this whole kind of a big gulp strategy when it really rains in California. Terrific plan. Metropolitan Board supported it. Then Governor Newsom got elected, and he sat down with us and said, I don't believe there's enough political consensus for this approach. There's a lot of opposition to it in Northern California and a fairly lukewarm support for it elsewhere because of the cost. And so he goes, but obviously something needs to be done. You heard Secretary Crowfoot say that. So his vision is one tunnel, slightly larger than the single tunnels before, but less than two-barrel tunnel. And so roughly a 2/3 approach to what we've been planning is about where he's headed. That will require a review, a new environmental review process. It will require new permitting processes. We've been at this for a decade. So I said, why don't we treat it like a football stadium and just move it through without a new CEQA review? He said, nice try, but we're not going to do that. But he did say that he was going to work with us to expedite it. And we believe that by paralleling a number of the permitting processes, we still end up with the same endpoint, which was always projected to be about 2030. So he's going to say we're going to parallel the land procurement and design and some of the project procurement and acquisition to parallel it. Disagreed with some of his conclusions, but he's the guy who got elected. And I do agree with his major conclusion is we have to do something and we have to expedite it. And on that, we are in complete sync with this governor on getting it done.
Great, thank you. Doug, I wanted to come back to you. I was privileged to serve on the advisory committee on the One Water LA initiative, and a lot of the measures that we're seeing come to the fore now actually, had perhaps their origins in that whole process. You were very instrumental in moving that initiative forward. Can you tell the audience about it? And I know that there were a lot of ideas that came up as a result of the One Water LA initiative. What is happening? To what extent are we seeing those ideas actually reach a stage of implementation?
Thank you, David. Something I'm proud of, but I think everyone in the city and all the other agencies that collaborated on that incredible roadmap, if you will, should and still are proud of. So One Water essentially is thinking of water as a complete cycle. So no matter if it's drinking water coming out of your tap, wastewater that's going down your sinks or toilets, groundwater that's being stored for future use, water up in the clouds, where we're praying always for it to come down. Our prayers came true this last winter. It's all a scarce commodity, and it needs to be extremely treated like it's very valuable, like you would your own bank account, right? So to the degree that we looked at all the infrastructure that supports keeping water in those various phases, if you will, and making sure that the infrastructure is sound, that it can withstand any attack, whether it be human or natural origin, looking at the regulations that we've talked about a little bit earlier today, and that we, in the industry, concern ourselves with, that may come from Sacramento or regionally. Not too much is coming from the feds these particular years. Population patterns of growth. We were actually very focused on growth of California, and what we found 10, 12 years ago was the opposite, right? We had that huge recession, all right, and a lot of people decided to leave. Some businesses shut down, unfortunately, but people learned how to conserve as an urgent necessity in order for them to pay their mortgages and meet their obligations. And that did something to this infrastructure that was built 40, 50, 60 years ago that's still in place. And how do you deal with lower flows? How do you deal with the drought that came along in those many years, as Jeff was mentioning, where virtually every year has been dry? So we had to get very tactical in our approach and look at how do we divert what little stormwater we do get into our sewers. In Los Angeles, we have a separate system. The sewer system is one system. The stormwater goes out from the catch basins out to our river, lakes, and beaches. We don't capture it. And in Los Angeles, we've also had to work with educating our population about how a lot of what we quote-unquote call stormwater is a euphemistically urban slobber, if you will. It's the runoff that comes from our lawns being overwatered, people who might be hosing down their driveways or washing their cars, right? Picking up all the pollutants, all the visible trash and all the invisible nutrients and contaminants, right? Heavy metals, oil, and grease that gets into that conglomeration that sadly will be very toxic to marine and animal life and plant life in our estuaries and at our beaches. So all of that combined is how do we then put that one water plan together to try to realize how can we be successful given the limited dollars that we have to stretch at that time. So the answer, David, was multi-benefit solutions, right? So we look for projects where we can capture, treat, and reuse water in our parks and our open spaces. How do we reduce the amount of flooding that we historically see but often don't have the money to fix? How do we deal with the water quality initiatives that are coming down the pike? And then also the supply, right? How do we, through the infiltration, we can increase our supply so we're less dependent on paying for all that water coming down, right? It's almost like, think of Mother Nature as a Postmates or Grubhub bringing that water right to your doorstep, and people are going to say, no, I don't think I'm going to wait for us to, pay it and bring it down through the mail system, right? 350, 400 miles away. It's far cheaper to take it when it's right then and there. So a lot of education towards rain barrels and cisterns locally. Businesses, of course, are smart and innovative in learning how to do it, in the breweries, et cetera. So this whole embrace of how can we treat water so precious and be ready for whatever may happen. We don't know when some of this may happen, but we're going to be far readier than we were before we had this plan.
Right, thank you. Thank you. Which again brings us back to the fact that it requires an investment to be made. Absolutely. All of these things do. And that requires, as Judith said, transparency communication. Let me turn to you very quickly, John, and then I have another question to ask Judith. But the drought shone a new light on groundwater management. We saw throughout the state, especially in the Central Valley, subsidence as there was overpumping of groundwater. The ag industry was so often so desperate for water that they had to get the water from groundwater. it seems before this drought, it was perhaps not that much on people's mind, even though so much of our water comes from under the ground. Here in LA, about 10% of it comes from our aquifer in the San Fernando Valley. The groundwater basins under your jurisdiction have not been designated as groundwater basins of concern. But they still need to be managed. You need to make sure that that the pumping is managed and controlled, and so on. As we look to the future, what role do you see, especially the Central Basin and the West Basin aquifers playing in just the entire water picture of Southern California? Tell us quickly what you think.
Well, we're very fortunate in that we have several different aquifers at different levels below the ground, so that we can get 50% of our water, historically, from the 43 cities in the water replenishment districts area, comes from groundwater. And the water replenishment district was formed to manage that groundwater and reply it. That's why we're called the replenishment district. We used to buy water, sometimes 60,000 acre feet, from Metropolitan Water District through Central Basin to put into the spreading grounds. We don't do that anymore. We have decided that snowpacks is unreliable. We could see this about 15 years ago, and we decided to become 100%, that is my agency, the Water Replenishment District, 100% independent of imported water. And we've done that by partnering with Los Angeles County Sanitation Districts and taking their water from the San Jose Creek and recycling it. I could go into long details, but you don't want that. and putting it into the spreading ground so that we're independent of imported water. And our next goal, thinking ahead, in our Win for All program is to take 600,000 acre feet, that's 200 billion gallons of water that's located around Torrance, and cleaning that up and leaving that independent, and making our 43 cities independent. That's our long-range goal, if that answers your question.
It does. Thank you very much. And by the way, for anybody who might not know, an acre foot of water is about 325,000 gallons. So go ahead and do the math quickly in your head. Judith, back to you. So there is so much that's happening in the water world, right? So many initiatives and measures, and wastewater recycling, stormwater capture, aquifer remediation. And I think all of this requires, to a large extent, for the private sector to step up and to both meet the requirements and take advantage of the opportunities that all of this offers. I think in the water world, we haven't done, public-private partnerships are very much now part of the energy sector, not so much yet part of the water sector. But what do you see as kind of the innovations on the horizon that may help us realize all of these, essential, albeit ambitious goals that we have here?
Well, for innovation, of course, there's technology, right? Technology is being developed all the time, whether it's at a regional scale or at a smaller kind of decentralized scale. I know there's a lot of universities and incubators that are working on the technology to get reuse water, reclaimed water, to get that going in the market. But I'm going to touch on two things that I think aren't what you think about when you think about of innovation. And the first thing is just thinking about how we capture, how we use water, how we think about it on our projects. So a lot of times, or at least back in the day, we would, whenever we were doing a water project, we would only think about water issues on the project. Same thing with transportation. We would only think about getting a car from A to B. And the reality is that now, as we're looking at multi-benefit solutions, we can't think that way anymore. We've got to think differently about how we use not only the open space, but also the space where we all live, our houses, our buildings, our streets. All these are areas where we can really think about how we can store water, how we can do on-site treatment, how we can really be part of the solution to the challenge that we're facing on our water portfolio. So I think when I think of innovation, I think of thinking of projects with multiple lenses, not just looking at them from one particular angle, looking at them from different angles and making sure that we're finding a solution that touches on multiple elements. And what the second piece to that I think is important, that I think about in innovation that I don't see enough happening, is getting back to the citizens that voted for Measure W, the citizens that are ultimately going to be paying for the infrastructure improvements that we're doing within our county, getting them exposure to the technology directly. We have these events, we have conferences, we have different events that we go to. It's usually people that are pretty familiar with the technology, things that are going on, but what we don't have are the citizens, the ones that turn on their faucets and have water come out and don't really think about what happens and don't really think about the fact that they can drink it and nothing will happen to them. But those people that aren't exposed to this world every day, but ultimately will in some way pay for these improvements, having them be exposed to what the technology is, having them be exposed to these issues that we're facing, and letting them help us, be part of the solution. So those are the things that I think about when I think about innovation. Of course, when we talk about technology, there has to be checks and balances on that in itself. We have to make sure that any technology that's put out to the market has to have, redundancies in it. What happens if it fails? What happens with the operations and maintenance of that technology? So there has to be a way to check that, and I think hopefully public agencies are thinking about that and how they can be a part of that check on the technology before it goes out to the public, but definitely getting the public more engaged in the technology and what we're facing, in our infrastructure challenges, I think is a way to think about innovation, at least in my mind.
Thank you. Well, in that vein, let me ask a question of the whole panel. I believe that we could do a lot more to foster and encourage and finance many smaller water companies that have got tremendous ideas, but yet are unable to get those ideas to market. They wither on the vine because they either don't know how to access capital, or for one reason, or they're in that valley of death that's kind of, between the seed investors and the venture capital folks, and they're just unable to survive it. I'm very proud to serve on the board of the Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator, and I think we do a great job at LACY, but we have programs in our universities, we have incubators, and I wonder if any of you have thoughts as to what more we could do as we're kind of trying to embrace this brave new future of water, to actually, bring these companies, these ideas along. I'm not talking about the ones that don't deserve it, but there are many that have fantastic ideas, and we read about them. Companies that are able now to actually get water from the humidity in the air. And many of them just don't get the financing to be able to move forward, or they don't get the mentoring, or they don't know how to prepare a business plan. What can we do here in Southern California to try to encourage these minds to actually get to market? Don't all answer at once.
I'll take a crack at it, because I think you raise a good point, that you mentioned in part of the lead up to the previous question, this idea of using the energy model of public-private partnerships, and where can we bring private capital to bear on things that the government is doing, because we don't have unlimited resources either. And so I think that's an area that's ripe, and in fact, in the sustainability plan, one of the specific items is to foster and encourage those kinds of partnerships. We've created a unit within the county called the Center for Strategic Partnerships that is whole purpose is to foster these sorts of public-private partnerships. So I think there is interest and there is desire for us to find ways to help build up and uplift these innovative ideas. That said, and maybe to use a bad analogy here or metaphor, to throw a little bit of cold water perhaps on the role of government, government is not always the best at trying new things. Government tends to be a little more cautious and conservative and wants to see something proven before it puts it out. That's starting to change, and I think we're seeing that, for instance, on cool surfaces on streets. Governments are out trying to figure out how we can address the urban heat island effect and using private technology or innovative technology that hasn't yet been proven anywhere else. So I think there's an appetite and a desire. Certainly, if we're going to get to the kinds of aggressive, whether it's conservation goals or water quality goals or elimination of violations of water quality standards that we lay out in our plan, we're going to need all of these sorts of technologies. And so we're going to actively seek those kinds of partnerships.
One of the things I think that's exciting is Governor Newsom has put together an office in the governor's office on data collection and management, and they'll be appointing someone shortly to that role. And it's nice to see something at the statewide level that really wants to look at how do we, because we collect enormous amounts of data, but there is no centralized mechanism in California. The State Water Board isn't necessarily interfacing with the data that all the cities are generating on water use, water management. And so the governor's office is putting together an office that, with the idea of trying to get a lot of this data managed on a statewide basis and get it synchronized, and so that we're all collecting it and reporting it in the same fashion and uploading it together. That will enable technology and making it all open source so that technology can access that and then be able to work a little more effectively. Size matters when you're talking with water because it's not as expensive and not as lucrative as power. So people are going to do things at relatively low cost. Metropolitan, we have 19 million customers, and we've put together partnerships with the major metropolitans in the western U.S. And we call them technology assessment groups, and we work with Denver, Waters, Phoenix, and Southern Nevada, and all the major metropolitans in the West. And what we do is we meet once a quarter and analyze all the new technologies that we see, and then start farming them out among the various metropolitan areas to start testing which seems to work better and sharing that information. So it does help that you're seeing much more partnerships across the Southwest where we all have similar challenges.
Yeah, by the way, I agree that a government actually, I think, needs to be cautious and conservative because one's dealing with the public money. And so one shouldn't be, taking risks. But this is why I think it was so important for LA to form the Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator, so that body could be the body that could actually mentor, incubate, and also screen and vet the smaller companies that are coming up. We have Leilani tells me about 3 minutes left. So I wanted to throw out another question to all of you, and that is, in the next decade, in the next 10 years, what is the most important policy or project that you think will have the greatest impact on our water future?
Human resources.
Say again?
The human resource, the ability to retain knowledge. We, like many others in government, are going through the silver tsunami. So a lot of us are checking out, right, with a lot of substantial knowledge. And I'm not so sure in every corner of our buildings and offices and programs this is recorded very well, very completely. So to the degree that we need to get out as cohorts with some of the universities to establish platforms, to bring in some of that fresh talent, to try things, to do pilots. And I agree with you that, sort of the last bastion of integration is on the financial front, where, you know, $1 from this bucket shall not be used to go into that bucket. And that is starting to erode. Some of those silos are coming down, but to the degree that it's incumbent upon us to reach out, to work with the privates, the academics, to bring in that fresh talent so that we can train them, so they can shadow us, because those ideas are there. I just got back from a recruiting trip in Detroit, 17,000 black engineers just yearning to get involved in all kinds of things, from building the next Teslas and the next Apples, and, you know, there are a few of us that wanted to, you know, get into the environmental field, you know, where we are really looking to meet all these challenges of all these 20, 30, 20, 40, 20, 50 goals. So.
Right, thanks.
Sure.
Anybody else in the next 10 years, the most important policy or project? In 1 second?
I've got one too, but you go ahead.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, direct potable reuse, you know, and the legislation around that is going to be huge, I think, in the next 10 years. And then, I mean, all the projects that we're starting up right now, you know, they're going to hopefully be online in the next 10 years, and I think that that's going to be, you know, a huge game changer for us in the water industry, and seeing what that does to our portfolio and how we're more sustainable. So to me, I think that's kind of what's coming in the next 10 years.
Jeff?
Climate change adaptation, Secretary Crowfoot touched upon it. Water is kind of ground zero for temperature effects on water and how that moves, and that's going to really, all our infrastructure is based on an old model, not the new climate change world we're moving to.
Indeed, climate change. Go ahead, Gary.
Yeah, I think, you know, we've seen this in other sectors, but it hasn't quite hit water yet, and that's the notion of environmental justice. And we see real equity issues in Los Angeles County. Most of our water, most of the time, meets primary drinking water standards. We're not violating from that standpoint, but secondary drinking water standards affect taste and odor and color, and frequently the violations of those standards are in communities of color and low-income communities. And I think the environmental justice community, which has been so focused on air pollution and toxic air pollution, is starting to understand that its water is also an issue, and that's going to really, and I think it's important to start to drive the conversation to how do we ensure we have safe, affordable, clean water for everybody.
Great. John, your thoughts?
In a world of disruptive technologies, Judith beat me to the punch. It's direct potable resource, reuse.
Direct potable usage.
Yes.
Okay, and I would say the one project or policy that's going to be the most important in the next 10 years is everything we've been talking about. So, was this a great panel or what? Great. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks. Great.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adam Lane. I'm the Vice President of Programs for the LA Business Council. I've also been the voice of God behind today's event. Thank you. I just want to give you all one last thank you for joining us today. A major thank you to our host, the Getty Center. And can we please put our hands together for these great panelists and speakers and sponsors? For those of you who want to rewatch today's event, be sure to check out our brand new modernized website at labusinesscouncil.org. Use the hashtag LABC Summit 19 on your social media posts. And we look forward to seeing you this fall at our Housing, Transportation, and Jobs Summit. Thank you all. Have a great day.